Our scripture reading this morning is one of our appointed lectionary texts for the day. It comes from the letter to the Hebrews, which is one of those small letters in the New Testament, chapter 11, verse 29 through 12, chapter 2. And the passage begins with, you'll hear sort of a recap of some of the Bible's great heroes of faith, who, let's remember, were actually totally flawed human beings like you and like me. And I want you to especially listen closely near the end of the passage when you hear the text talk about the great cloud of witnesses and encouraging the church of the Hebrews to run the race that is set before us. So we'll listen for that cloud and that race. And let's listen now for the Spirit to speak. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as if it were dry land. But when the Egyptians attempted to do so, they were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after they had been encircled for 7 days. By faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had received the spies in peace. And what more should I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched raging fire, escaped the edge of the sword, won strength out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received their dead by resurrection. Others were tortured, refusing to accept release in order to obtain a better resurrection. Others suffered mocking and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned to death. They were sawn into two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, persecuted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains and in caves and holes in the ground. Yet all these, though they were commended for their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better so that they would not, apart from us, be made perfect. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, who for the sake of the joy that was set before him endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of God. The sermon is called Clouds, Dragonflies, and Relay Races. Will you pray with me, please? Christ, our teacher, you reach into our lives, not through instruction or doctrine, but through story. Open our hearts to being attentive, that seeing we may perceive, and hearing we may understand, and understanding our very lives might be transformed. Amen. After taxiing on the runway for what felt like ever, my arms already sore from trying to contain my now quite squirmy toddler, finally lift off. As the plane climbed higher and higher towards home, or rather leaving what was home to what's become home, my daughter reached her tiny curious hands toward the window and slid it open with all her might, and a piercing golden light flooded the dark cabin. Now we could see we were ascending through clusters of fluffy, flecked cumulus, surrounded by what Joni Mitchell calls rows and flows of angel hair and ice cream castles in the air and feather canyons everywhere. Zoe settled in my arms finally, and we just watched the clouds. Or rather, I watched her watch the clouds. I witnessed. The poet Louise Glick says, "We look at the world once in childhood. The rest is memory," which is lovely and evocative, except I think that we actually get the chance to look again at the world all the time, to witness, and suddenly have our own eyes renewed through the eyes of children, sure, and mystics, and all kinds of beloveds, and through the lenses of art, literature, science, music, even through ancient letters collected in this biblical canon and dusted off in church community. So let's witness. In today's reading from the book of Hebrews, that last passage pivots on all these stories, these kind of horrific and amazing stories of these great ancestors of faith, mythic. And then the writer of this letter turns to address directly the church of its day. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. Cloud here in its ancient context being a regularly used figure of speech, meaning a multitude, a crowd, a large group, but it carries a particularly divine air, vaporous, mysterious. For some reason, it makes me think of the Christmas story and the heavenly host of angels praising God, the cloud. Of course, there's also that great pillar of cloud, the symbol in the Hebrew Bible of God's presence, guiding the people of Israel through the desert towards the promised land. And so here we have this cloud of witnesses, this godly throng of what? Spirits, ancestors, memories. A cloud of witnesses. Witness. Witness can mean an onlooker, an observer, a watcher, someone who is there and can be relied on in the legal sense, perhaps. The cloud of witnesses, I started hearing Lin-Manuel Miranda from the musical Hamilton singing, "History has its eyes on you." The witnesses, not in a menacing way, but in an urgent way, like, come on, it's your turn now. The witnesses, and maybe in a devoted way, like a parent's loving gaze, just taking you in, delighting in you, witnessing. But then the Greek word for witnesses here, it means more than just spectators. As one commentator noticed, the verb form of this word witness, which is used 5 times in the preceding chapter, Hebrews 11, it's always referring to the giving or confirming of a testimony, rather than the mere watching of an event. And so this cloud of witnesses aren't just seeing, but speaking too, aren't just watching us, but bearing witness. Witnesses as in testifiers, just like those who climb bravely into this space to bring our own stories before God, which we do all the time and all summer long in our 7-word testimonies. Because we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, not just watching us, but cheering us on, encouraging us, speaking truth through the stories of their own lives, if we can listen and remember and feel them around us. Now to Dragonflies. In the novel I'm reading, which is called Women Talking by the Canadian novelist Miriam Taves, it tells the story of a group of women who are trying to figure out what to do next. They're Mennonite women, fictional but based on real communities, living in a secluded village and reeling from a series of trauma and violence at the hands of other members in their community. And they're trying to decide, should we stay in this beloved but oppressive community, putting themselves and their children under sure threat of more violence, or should they flee the only home they've ever known into great uncertainty? And as they debate, there was one of many asides which glimmered out to me. One of the characters remarks to the others gathered on, did you know about the migration period of butterflies and dragonflies? The migration period is so long that it's often only the grandchildren that arrive at the intended destination. The woman looks to the dragonflies as she's trying to convince the other women that changes matter, that our flight patterns matter, even if we may not be around to see the full realization of equality or healing or justice, and that the immediate results of our choices may not be the primary criterion on which we base those choices. Like the generations of dragonflies who make only one leg of their yearly migrations for the sake of an offspring who, as Carolyn said, they may not know and may not ever see. So too, people of faith, we don't always get to see our dreams and God's promises fully realized on this side of eternity anyway. Hey, even Moses, the greatest hero of the Hebrew Bible, perhaps, even Moses didn't get to make it to the promised land. In our own context, we might feel, I know I do, sometimes as paralyzed as those trauma-stricken women in the novel I'm reading around issues of the precarious migration of other fellow children of God, around the enormity of the threat of climate change, around the despairing cycle of gun violence. These crises can feel insurmountable, and it's hard sometimes to keep the faith, to even know what it means to be a person of faith in the face of these crises. Looking to the dragonflies, I wonder, in the midst of the paralysis of the present moment, if we listen for the cloud of witnesses that surrounds us, to zoom out and take the long view, as the author of Hebrews says, whatever you think of as your promised land may not come to pass as you expect it in your sight. But there is a greater promise hidden within it, a communal promise that can only be realized together through a longer time scale. Thinking about great movements throughout history, for example, the women's suffrage movement, which while 100 years ago took itself about 100 years to make its way towards justice. And yet I can feel, even within myself, frustration and impatience coming up and say, isn't this just the tepid gospel of incremental change, which can sometimes be used to quell necessary revolutionary impulses? I mean, sometimes radical change is needed now. But the dragonflies and the cloud of witnesses whisper to us in this kind of late summer haze that our story is never the full story. As a beloved Hebrew prayer puts it, you are not obligated to complete the work. But then it says, neither are you free to abandon it. In one version of one of the verses from our reading from Eugene Peterson's version of the Message, he puts it this way: God had a better plan for us, that their faith, the faith of our ancestors and forebears, and our faith would come together to make one completed whole, their lives of faith not complete apart from ours. They start a story that we are still living into fruition and will not be completed in our lifetime. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside everything that weighs us down and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us. Now to relay races. There is a race ahead. In fact, we're already running it. Can you see the trail? The writer of the letter to the Hebrews says, keep running. Let us run and not grow weary. Run with perseverance. Run with endurance, tenacity, grit, stick-to-itiveness. Because you see, to use the cliche, life and faith, they're less a sprint and more a marathon, or actually, maybe they're like an ultra marathon. I'm not much of a runner myself, but the town that I grew up in was at the exact halfway point of the Boston Marathon. And so every marathon Monday, we would gather down in the center of town on the sidelines to cheer on the runners. And I sometimes knew someone who was coming by, but mostly it was just this sea of faces from people all around the world. And I loved being at the halfway point because as they passed, you could see, or I imagined you could see the relief, the assurance kind of wash over their faces. I've made it halfway. I can make it. I imagine the great cloud of witnesses, like the throng gathered along the sidelines of a race, saying, "We finished the race. You can do it too." And if faith is a race we are running together, then really it's a relay race through the ages, our spiritual forebears passing the torch. It's a relay race in that the entire team is depending on you. Or rather, we're depending on one another, the ones who came before and the ones who will come after. You are not alone. And your leg of the race, it's limited, thank God. In the grand scheme of things, it will be over pretty soon. But it's important. It's as important as any leg of this race. Take a breath. You got to pace yourself when you're running a marathon. Take a breath, and I invite you maybe to let your eyes close or ascend in your own mind's eye up and back into the clouds of your imagination, the ice cream castles of your own ancestry, your own spiritual influences. Who do you see up there? What faces form in the clouds? Maybe it's the kind face of Jesus, right there along with your mother. Oh, and your lovely, curmudgeonly Sunday school teacher, she's there. And that one meditation teacher whose presence felt like warm rain. And there's Dostoevsky. Oh, and Gandhi, hey. And isn't that your childhood dog? And the tree you used to hide in? And who else is up there? They're always there. Imagine them speaking to you, whispering, "Keep going. That's the way. You got this. We need you." When you are feeling discouraged or despairing by the enormity of the world's pain, or by the current unfolding of your own life, or the precarity of life in general, if your own faith feels shaky, like a baby bird in the palm of your hand, look up at the clouds. Consider the dragonflies. Watch some kids at a summer picnic run their hearts out in a relay race, scrambling in a potato sack, running with that wild, free abandon, not to win, but for the sheer thrill of it, the joy, the whirl. And don't forget to keep your eyes on Jesus and your ears open to the witnesses who surround you, cheering you on. Keep going. That's the way. You got this. We need you. Amen.